One of the main things I've been doing in the past 5 to 10 years has been to try to bring contemplative philosophy into conversation with scholastic philosophy, philosophy that's done in the universities in the Middle Ages. This is a relatively new thing because most people haven't thought to turn to the contemplative tradition within discussions of medieval philosophy. There's a beautiful, gorgeous, rich history of the contemplative tradition that's covered by religious studies, gender studies, English lit, any number of other subdisciplines. But within the discussions of philosophy, it's basically been ignored in favor of the sort of straight up scholastic philosophers like Aquinas and Bonaventure and Duns Scotus and all the rest. The reason that's important is when we're talking about self-knowledge in the Middle Ages, the view that tends to get put forward is very focused on a very narrow set of issues. It's the set of issues that scholastic philosophers were interested in, which are issues about epistemology, metaphysics, and much less about self-knowledge as a way of making moral progress. When you start talking about doing new narratives in the history of philosophy, there tends to instantly be a lot of worry that this means throwing out the old philosophy, that somehow if we start talking about contemplative philosophers, we're not going to talk about Aquinas anymore. And I want to be really clear that that is not at all what I'm interested in doing. Instead, I'm interested in using contemplative philosophy to complement the existing knowledge we already have about philosophy in the Middle Ages so that we don't end up with this skewed picture that only represents one small part of what people in the Middle Ages were thinking about when they thought about self-knowledge. It's for this reason that I have the methodological note on your handout that this isn't an either-or situation. It's not like we stop talking about the scholastics in order to talk about the contemplatives. It's more a both-and approach. If you're interested in questions of epistemic frameworks and self-knowledge, then go read the scholastics. If you're interested in questions of personal progress, moral growth, moral psychology, ethics, then look to the contemplatives. In the rest of this talk, I'm going to be focusing on contemplative views of self-knowledge in the 13th and 15th centuries because there are some common themes that emerge there and that I think are really important for understanding the full scope of how the medievals thought about self-knowledge. You find an astonishing amount of similarity on some of these basic tenets across England, across the lowlands, Germany, Italy, France. There are these presuppositions about what exactly we want when we want self-knowledge, how we should try to get it, and then the ultimate end for which we want this knowledge in the first place. So what is it going to do for us? For the scholastics, the answer to this is going to have to do with whether or not your system of epistemology is coherent, or whether we're the kinds of things that can be known as particulars. For the contemplatives, the question of self-knowledge is much more fundamental than that. It's nothing less than the ground in which humility roots itself and from which the other virtues grow. In short, it's a precondition for our making any kind of moral or spiritual progress in this life. It's essential for us to reach our final end as human beings. And this is, of course, especially important for everybody in the Middle Ages who sees union with God as being the ultimate fulfillment of human nature. Self-knowledge is portrayed as essential for attaining union with God. I'm going to talk about 3 particular recommendations that contemplatives give for how to acquire self-knowledge. And you'll see how they hook up with each other as we go. So the first recommendation that you get is that we need to use the faculties of reason and imagination to overcome selfish pride. The second recommendation is that we need to look outside ourselves to know ourselves. In short, self-knowledge in the way that contemplatives are interested in can't happen in isolation from communities. Third, there's this idea that we need to root down in humility in order to attain dignity. So this is both a recommendation for attaining self-knowledge and the sort of picture of the payout for doing so. When you finally attain self-knowledge, you've grounded yourself such that you can then understand, appreciate, and grow into our inherent dignity as human beings. The first thing that we need to do is become aware of our attachment to ourselves. As the anonymous English Book of Privy Counseling puts it, we need to gnaw on the naked blind feeling of thine own being. This involves turning on yourself and really grappling with exactly the kinds of issues that we try to avoid. Hadwich, a 13th century Flemish beguine, that is a lay person who takes religious vows and lives in community with other religious women, but who isn't cloistered and doesn't become a nun, Hadwich writes a lot of letters of advice to fellow beguines. So as she puts it, learn to know yourselves in your attraction or aversion, in your behavior, in love, in hate, in fidelity, in mistrust, and in all the things that befall you. In short, if you want to become aware of yourself in such a way that you can make moral and spiritual progress, you need to take an unflinching and frank assessment. In order to do this, a common recommendation is that we use reason and imagination to overcome the selfish pride that keeps us from confronting ourselves. Catherine of Siena, who's a late 14th century Italian Dominican affiliated woman, writes that evil is grounded in selfish love of oneself, and this love is a cloud that blots out the light of reason. If we stop trying to introspect, so if we neglect the practice of self-examination, Hadwich says, we fall back into our own self-complacency. We no longer grow and we no longer make progress. The reason we need to use both reason and imagination to overcome selfish pride is that reason itself can get distracted, can get worked around, and imagination helps engage our senses as well as our mind to try to focus on what we're doing. And so Mechtild of Magdeburg, in The Flowing Light of the Godhead, has this description where she casts herself as a noble woman who's dressing up to meet her beloved. Only here, she talks about the particular steps she takes in order to come to a frank assessment of who she is. She puts it, I put on the shoes of the precious time that I've wasted day after day. And if you can't sympathize with that, then, you're a better person than I am. I gird myself with the suffering I have caused, she says. I put on the cloak of the wickedness of which I am full. I put on my head a crown of secret, shameful acts that I have committed against God. After this, I take in my hand the mirror of true knowledge. Then I look at myself and I see who I really am. Now, at first blush, you can look at this and have the instinctive recoil of first, this seems like self-loathing piled on self-loathing, and then second, this also seems like internalized misogyny, right? So why is this woman portraying herself as such a wretched, horrible person? It's important to understand that in discussions of contemplative self-knowledge, especially in the Middle Ages, this kind of process is what you engage in order to get past that cloud of selfish love. Although it uses the description of putting on clothes, you can also think of the description of taking off layers that we've built around ourselves to protect us from gnawing on our own naked being. So when Mechthild talks about looking in the mirror of true knowledge, what's reflected is herself, pure and simple, no more, no less. This mirror is one of the dominant metaphors in discussions of self-knowledge. The other is a tree, as we'll see later. Christine de Pizan continues this metaphor of the mirror. When she writes the City of Ladies, reason, justice, and rectitude come to visit her and help her build the City of Ladies. Reason holds, instead of a scepter, a mirror that she describes as the mirror of self-knowledge. She says, no one can look in this mirror without achieving clear self-knowledge. And we see that as literally foundational when Lady Reason goes on to help Christine lay the foundations for the City of Ladies, right? The defense of women that rectitude and justice help build on top of. We see again this emphasis on the need to clear the deck, so to speak, in the pursuit of wisdom, which says when a mirror is clean, everything can be seen in it clearly. But when the mirror is dirty, you can see nothing clearly in it. It is just the same with your soul. When it is dirty, you know neither yourself nor God. So this is one of the first places where we see that knowledge of ourselves is intrinsically linked in this tradition with knowledge of God. And that's significant because knowledge of God is the highest object of knowledge possible. Self-knowledge, foundational. Knowledge of God, the highest that human beings can possibly attain, and yet they're intrinsically bound together in ways that we're going to continue to see, especially in the third section. Okay, so you need to look outside yourself to know yourself. This recommendation emphasizes the extent to which we need to live in community. So self-knowledge is an ongoing process. In the contemplative tradition in the Middle Ages, it's also part of other spiritual disciplines. So you would look inside yourself, you would introspect in a context where you didn't devolve into self-loathing, but rather you ground yourself. You get to the ground of your own being, and then you can build up from there. But sometimes to get to the ground of our own being, we need the help of people outside of ourselves. You have to rely on other people. It's like Aristotle's phronimos. You need to have a prudent person who knows you and who can call you on your crap, right? Often we're not able to get a sort of clean perception of ourselves because we've distorted things enough that we need somebody else to kind of come in and, on the one hand, affirm us for the things that we're good at, that we keep downplaying, and on the other hand, to tell us to cut out the practices that are getting in the way of our progress to become the kind of people that we want to be. In other words, you can try to convince yourself, sitting there quietly in your study, that you have attained clear self-knowledge, that you know what your tendencies really are, but there's nothing like going out in the real world and having to deal with annoying people to test yourself and find out whether you're right about your patience, or find out whether you're right about whether you've actually conquered your problem with anger, whatever. Catherine of Siena puts this memorably when she says, "Virtue cannot be perfected or bear fruit except by means of your neighbors." And I say the same voice. Every one of them is committed by means of your neighbors. In short, it's easy to tell yourself that you've made progress in patience or anger until you're in a situation where other people are being really annoying and you have to find out whether you have actually managed to become patient, whether you've actually managed to get over irrational anger at, people cutting in line or what have you. So this is another important aspect of self-knowledge that requires being in community. Finally, the last piece of advice that I want to talk about for how contemplatives tell us to acquire self-knowledge is that we need to root down in humility in order to rise up in dignity. This is important because this is where we see the idea that self-knowledge is not just a matter of kind of, thinking about ourselves and just kind of getting caught in that circle and getting stuck, right? It's really easy to think of what, like the Camus and Sartre and everybody who's talking about existentialism. I mean, they're really worried about the self and about knowing whether we're acting authentically, but it's kind of this, abyss. The choices that you're faced with make you realize that everything's meaningless. And so it's helpful to see that in the medieval contemplative tradition, that's not the case at all. The introspection that we do and the turning inward and outward is meant to sort of clear the ground so that we can grow into the best possible versions of ourselves. As Johannes Thaler puts it, he's a 14th century Dominican. In order to gain the crown of perfection, there is nothing more important than to sink down into the deepest ground and into the root of humility. Just as a tree's height comes out of its deepest root, so too everything that is high in this life comes from the ground of humility. Catherine of Siena uses the same image of a tree in her discussion of self-knowledge in the dialogue. She says, "Think of the soul as a tree made by love and living only by love. The circle in which this tree's root must grow is true knowledge of herself." Now, here we see knowledge which is joined to me, God, who like the circle have neither beginning nor end. The knowledge is grounded in the soil of true humility, which is as great as the expanse of the circle. And I've included the image here of one of the famous unicorn tapestries that's in the Met Cloisters Museum, because you see here, along with the unicorn, a tree that's growing inside of a circular enclosure. And so you think about like the roots that are growing into the ground there, and it's what's letting the dignity arise and the fruit. The idea about fruits of the spirit, the idea about fruits of moral progress also come to play really strongly in this part of the tradition. Catherine of Siena also uses the mirror image that we saw earlier. And so here's an image of one of the unicorn tapestries that's actually from the Cluny Museum in Paris. And what we see is that we have the fine lady. The soul is often represented as a sort of fine or noble woman in the medieval contemplative tradition. As the soul comes to know herself, she also knows God better, for she sees how good he has been to her. In the gentle mirror of God, she sees her own dignity. She is the image of God, Catherine of Siena says. Julian of Norwich, who's a late 14th century English anchorite, connects the idea of rootedness with the idea of gaining knowledge of God. Our soul is so deeply rooted in God, she says, where it is infinitely treasured, right? So here's the idea again of intrinsic worth. Human beings look at themselves, and first what they need to see is sort of, you hit the ground of their being. But when they hit the ground of their being, that's when they can see that they possess intrinsic worth. So Jillian says, we cannot come to know ourselves until we have first come to know God. That sounds like a big order. And yet we've already seen, right, there's going to be this kind of circular feedback loop. And it's going to be a feedback loop that eventually grows up and out. As Jillian puts it, we have within our nature this wise and powerful desire to truly know ourselves. And so, whether we are moved to seek God or our own souls, the Holy Spirit leads through grace to know them both as one. So the idea here, again, is that no matter which direction you come at it, knowledge of self is going to be intrinsically related to knowledge of God. It's not just the precondition for making moral and spiritual progress. It's seen as intrinsically related to the fulfillment of human nature itself. As Jillian of Norwich says, and this is like halfway through the quote there, in the fulfillment of this knowledge of ourselves, we shall clearly and truly know our God in the fullness of never-ending joy. The pursuit of wisdom kind of ties this all together really pithily when it says, if we exercise ourselves diligently and for a long while in those spiritual works by means of which we are taught to know ourselves, right? So if we do all the work that I've been talking about, we can be lifted up to the knowledge and contemplation of God. And if that doesn't move you, you can think of it purely in terms of reaching our potential as human beings. So if we as human beings are naturally curious and naturally interested in knowledge, self-knowledge, so to speak, cleans the mirror, cleans the lens is a better way of putting it, through which we look at the world. The less distortion that's there, the clearer our vision of the world and of people around us is going to be. And that's necessarily going to lead to a more flourishing life. And in Q&A, you guys are welcome to ask about the constraints of a flourishing life, because obviously what medieval contemplatives are thinking of here differs in important and interesting ways from a lot of what we talk about today. At the same time, I think it's obvious that the kind of practical advice that the contemplatives are offering here about how to come to know ourselves and how to grow in moral and spiritual terms gives us a motivation for self-knowledge that the scholastic discussions don't provide. Finally, in the short time that I've got left, I just wanted to give mostly a promissory note about the idea of metaphor as philosophical methodology in the contemplative tradition. Scholars outside of philosophy have spent a long time talking and exploring the ideas of metaphor in medieval texts. Philosophers, however, in part because they've ignored the contemplative tradition entirely, but also just because of these presuppositions about how philosophy is carried out, philosophers have tended to ignore this issue of metaphor and its use. If anything, I think philosophers tend to see metaphor as illustrative. But if you pay close attention to what's actually happening in the contemplative tradition, metaphor, and here I'm not just talking about the medieval Christian tradition, but contemplative traditions across religions. I just listened to a talk about Korean contemplative metaphors and was struck by some of the similarities and parallels. And the idea is metaphor provides access to ideas and experience via a showing rather than telling. The contemplative tradition's use of metaphor is meant to enrich but also transcend some of what we can get across via propositional content. And the way they do that is by using these metaphors that evoke sensation and emotion as well as provide information. So I said in some ways this is a promissory note. In part, that's because of the amount of time that I've got, but also in part, it's because this is related to where my research is going. My next project is a book-length manuscript on self-knowledge in the medieval contemplative tradition, where part of what I want to do is to talk about metaphor as philosophical methodology, hook it up with things like what Liz Camp is doing and what a number of other contemporary philosophers are doing, but then also use it to show the practical output that philosophy can have. I love the idea of philosophy being this multivarious sort of discipline where we can connect with virtually any other field or any other line of inquiry. And part of the line of inquiry that's really driving me at the moment is this idea of taking these very homely examples, like when Catherine of Siena talks about clothing yourself. And that's not an accidental metaphor for her. Her father was a cloth dyer. And so she's grown up in this household where cloth and clothing is incredibly important, right? So the idea of clothing yourself here takes on all these extra layers. So part of what I want to do is explore how these sorts of metaphors enrich our understanding of the phenomenon of self-knowledge and the ways in which this forms bridges between disciplines. You'll notice that I've used, art here. I've used a bunch of different genres. If you've read the book that I sent, you'll notice that a lot of the people that I'm quoting there are from different disciplines as well as philosophy. For me, part of what's really motivating me here is the idea that philosophy is it's getting really cliched, right? Philosophy is a way of life, but it is, right? Philosophy can be a way to take what we think, experience, believe, and put it into practice in the world around us. In conclusion, then, what I've tried to do in this talk is present some of the contemplative views on self-knowledge in the 13th to 15th centuries to show how their approach to the question of self-knowledge complements existing discussions in scholastic medieval philosophy, which focus on epistemology and metaphysics, right? These contemplative discussions are all about how do we live and how do we actually make spiritual progress, right? It's one thing to want to be a better person. It's another thing to figure out how to actually become a better person. And that's one of the things that I find the most interesting about the contemplative tradition. It's focused on those questions. There's a lot of practical advice. There's a lot of acknowledgement that we screw up. It's a great non-ideal account of human nature. But at the same time, it's an optimistic, positive account because it sees human beings as having intrinsic worth, right? As having inherent dignity. And our quest in trying to gain knowledge of ourselves is to ground ourselves deeply and robustly enough that we can actually make this kind of progress and become the kind of people that we want to be, so that we can live in the kinds of communities that we want to take part in.